First of all, Huw, everybody talks about October the 17th. Is that the crucial date? What will happen on October the 17th?
Well, October 17th is the day when the US Treasury estimates they're going to get down to a floor in terms of their cash reserves where they really cannot credibly run the government from a cash flow perspective. That doesn't mean that's the last day when the debt ceiling can be extended. The debt ceiling is a number, it's not a date which is set in stone. So October 17 is an estimate. What we do know for certain is that they need to pay debt service payments on October 30. They have regular outgoings on November the 1st, which will far exhaust what they will have on hand at that stage. And then they also have a lot of money going out the door on November 15. So these are the real key not negotiable deadlines when the US Treasury has to become liquid and cash rich again if it's to meet its ongoing obligations.
Obviously, most people, the markets included, expect that there will be an 11th hour deal. They're not even looking really at these dates, particularly into mid-November, are they?
Well, certainly. They've been very well trained. We've run up to the brink many times in the last couple of years, and there's always been something which has stayed the execution. Not for long enough, though. That's why we have to keep repeating these circumstances. Now, personally, I'm much more nervous going into this particular instance than I have been previously. The negotiations seem to be a long way apart, if you can call them the negotiations. So the idea that this one is as benign as the last, I think that might be a little bit too complacent, but certainly the financial markets, we haven't really seen the kind of tremors you would see if they were ascribing anything more than, say, a 1% probability to a bad outcome.
I suppose what it does show, continually coming up against this ceiling, is that we have politicians that are unable to deal with the problem at hand.
Well, absolutely. We have delays, but we have all this demand for concessions. And the debt ceiling, it should be absolutely formulaic. That's the way we tend to deal with it in Australia. But in the US, it has become this great negotiating tool and idea to get yourself in the newspapers, to get coverage, to grandstand. All of these opportunities politicians are taking with open arms. Now, it's terrible for the US's international reputation. It doesn't look like an honourable debtor when it is prepared to play with it, the idea that it might default on debt, albeit temporarily, all for political concessions domestically. Then in the long run, enormously difficult decisions need to be made, and we're chewing up all this energy on what should just be, as I said, very formulaic and mechanical.
What will the effect of all of this be on growth, both world growth and growth here in Australia?
Well, the US is at the centre of the global economy, and I certainly think that the public sector's influence on the US economy in 2014 will be negative. I think that presently most forecasts are based on the assumption that it will be neutral, having been very negative in 2013, which actually gets back to the last major deal that we did on a debt ceiling, which came with all these concessions of mandated spending cuts. I think that the negotiation that we eventually get will actually come with similar mandated spending cuts on top of what we already have, and that will hit growth next year. And that means your world growth number needs to come down in line with your US number, your emerging market forecasts for China and India and Brazil need to come down, and that has implications for all. And it has implications for Australia. We think that world growth will be slower than 3% in 2014, whereas the IMF's most recent numbers, which are only a couple of weeks old, they think 3.6% is the number that they're looking for. We think that's much too high, and therefore we think that people who really benchmark to the IMF, like the Reserve Bank of Australia, like the Australian Treasury, will be having to reconsider their numbers in early 2014 once we move through this current period.
Now, you said you're a little bit more nervous about this one. So are debt holders as well, and we've seen China particularly make some strong comments.
Oh, look, the Chinese are the biggest single holder outside the US Federal Reserve. The Japanese are not far behind. There are huge numbers of foreign reserves which are invested in the US Treasury market denominated in US dollars. And if over the long run the US's fiscal vulnerability comes through in that price, they will face very, very large paper losses. And there will be some explaining to do. But for now, there is no alternative for these holders. They have trillions of dollars to invest. They need liquidity. And the US Treasury market, for better or for worse, is the only market that provides them with the scale and the liquidity which meets those very, very important criteria for foreign exchange reserve managers.
When you look ahead, and I know no one has a crystal ball, but when you look ahead 10 years' time from now and you particularly look at the level of debt in America, and it's what seems sometimes to be, it almost looks like it's heading towards a stage where it can't pay for its debts. What is your long-term prognosis for the world economy when you look at the situation in America?
Well, when you look at the US situation over the long run, you see a fiscal trajectory which is quite frightening, very dangerous. And therefore, if you cast your mind forward many decades, it is absolutely clear that the global economy will have to develop an alternative to a US dollar, US Treasury-centric system, which we currently have. Now, the obvious candidate here is the economy which will be the largest in the world for most of the next 2 generations, which is China. China, of course, though, has very immature financial markets. It has a currency which is not fully flexible yet. It does not have open capital accounts. It has enormous shortfalls, if you will, in terms of supplanting the US dollar today. Come back to me in 20 years' time and maybe some of those disadvantages are not there, and the US fiscal trajectory is starting to look increasingly dangerous, because if you don't take difficult decisions on both expenditures in the United States, particularly on the healthcare side, but also on raising revenues, then the budget is not going to add up very well at all once we get into the 2020s.
Is it possible to do what needs to be done in America? Can you cut spending to the extent that you would need to and still have the fabric of society?
Well, I prefer not to actually focus on spending, and that's precisely where the congressional debate is, and that's why it's so difficult. If you ask the American populace through polls which programs specifically they would cut, even if they support cuts in spending overall as a concept, well, they don't know which box to tick because they all seem quite reasonable and quite important. So when you go from the general to the specific on cutting spending, it's exceptionally difficult. And this is where the negotiations fall down, because the Republicans have all signed the no tax pledges. And this is one of the poison pills in the US political system, that Republicans have to rebadge, recategorise to get around these pledges, which are sitting in a gentleman's filing cabinet in Washington, DC. So until you actually look very seriously at the revenue side, you're just never going to get a decent outcome here. The US should have a national sales tax. They should get rid of many tax expenditures, and they should also look at a number of things like raising the capital gains tax, raising the payroll tax, and also raising the threshold at which those taxes actually hit their ceiling. There's lots of things you can do. There's an enormous amount of loopholes in that tax system, and as a share of GDP, the US government is small relative to its OECD counterparts.
It sounds like a program, though, that you wouldn't even get moderate Republicans agreeing to, never mind Tea Party Republicans. You're talking about raising taxes all over the place.
Well, there are many, many places where they ought to be raised. If you think about OECD norms, and I'm not saying that they should become Scandinavia overnight, but certainly not having a national sales tax it makes them an enormous outlier across the OECD. Some states do have sales taxes, independent ones, but a national sales tax levied at even a low rate like 5% would make quite a difference. And there are so many things in the US tax system which benefit the wealthy and those with very large pools of assets at the expense of those who are earning much less, allocating all of their income to ongoing expenses and find it very difficult to accrue wealth in the background. the US tax system is skewed towards the haves, and they need to pay more. And that's one of the perversities of the debate in Congress, if you will, is that the Tea Party purports to be supporting middle America, conservative middle America, yet it's actually the real top end of town and the super wealthy who do the best out of the current situation.
So what you're saying is it is doable as long as difficult decisions on tax raising are tackled.
Look, this is one of the key things that the global rating agencies look at, is they look at the trajectory of the economy under no change policy, and they say, okay, well, the budget will be in a lot of trouble under no change policy. But do they have room to move and actually get more revenue out of the system? And they look at the US and they say, absolutely, there's the potential to do this. Then they look at the politics and say, how likely is it that they would actually move here? It's very different to looking at a country like France, where they've really tapped every single source of revenue they possibly can, and the government's footprint is more than half of national income. It's not the case in the United States. There's many areas they could tackle, but this is where you get back to the vested interests who've argued for all of these loopholes and have got them over time. They will fight tooth and nail to keep them.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Great.